Hello guys, welcome to the stream. So it starts soon, 5 minutes, waiting for everyone to join. I'm gonna start the stream in a minute or so. So I'm starting. Welcome to my Unity workshop. My name is Sarkis and I'm a computer science student at Watt. My workshop is going to be about a platformer game in Unity. I'm going to have a bit of technical stuff, more game dev stuff, design stuff, and hope you'll enjoy it. Starting off, I'm going to show a bit of my game, or the entire game actually. It's a platform game, side-scrolling, with jumping, platforms, basic stuff. I'll get in depth into the game design choices and the controls. For now, just enjoy and watch the game. Here, there's combat, and there are obstacles that hurt you. I came up with an interesting mechanic here to allow you to get through obstacles like this by striking objects underneath you. I thought it was necessary to create some interesting mechanics for a platformer. Every platform has an interesting mechanic that makes it unique compared to others, and I thought this would create some spice in the game. Here's the second level, and we get to be introduced to a new mechanic here, which is the bow. It's a ranged weapon, mostly used to fight enemies with. And you can also knock them off the platform if you want. And this is the third and last level, where it's a bit more challenging. Tests all your knowledge about the game mechanics so far. Here you have to use the same mechanic twice. And lastly, the last weapon you're granted allows you to replicate the mechanic, but this time you get to choose which place where that object is, or the hazard is. Like that. So that's about it for the demo. I'd like to get into the technical stuff of Unity. Right now, any questions so far? Anyone's got any questions? Yes, question, please do ask. No, the bow does not have a pushback. It just makes you float a little bit in the air, just to make it feel smoother. I'll get into the technical details. Well, I didn't explain that, but once you pick up a weapon, you'll be able to cycle through them using the A and S key. No, this is just a demo, so I won't be adding any more extra mechanics. I might, but currently no. So someone asked what are the characters named. Let's go meet them. This guy is Hani. He's the sword master. He gives you a sword. Let's meet the other guy. This is Talal, the archer. He gives you a bow. Ouch, I fell down. So we can skip through this all, and lastly, this is Kayvon, the wizard. That's the important part. Yes, true. So let's get into the mechanics. First of all, any platformer needs movement and jump. Otherwise you can't get past the platforms. Most platformers have this the satisfactory mechanic where if you hold on a button long enough, hold on the jump button long enough, you get to float a little more. So there's like a short jump, which is this, and the longer jump, which is holding down the button like this. Because remember when you used to hold down buttons hard enough and thinking it will change something? Yes, it does actually. The jump, usually in platformers. Second of all, another mechanic in platformers is the Quixote time. Quixote time is when you fall off a platform, you're given a small leeway to jump off that platform. So you're not punished too hard for walking off the platform accidentally when you want to jump at the last moment. You can pay close attention, player falls down, and you jump. Third mechanic is the jump buffering. Jumping happens the moment when you press the key. And if you hold down the key, it doesn't jump again. So what do you do if you want to constantly jump? What jump buffering does is that when you press the jump button mid-air, it buffers it. And the moment you land, you jump again. By the way, all of this is available on the GitHub, the code, and you can play a build. That's also on the GitHub. So you don't need Unity to run all this. And lastly, we have the direction change mechanic, where usually when you jump, this is a physics-based game, so uses physics. So when you want to change directions, you'll be applying forces, so you'll be wasting time deaccelerating instead of changing directions. So what this mechanic allows you to do is immediately change directions mid-air. There is no reason for this in this game currently, but most platformers do it, and it's usually gives player more control mid-air. It makes the game easier and more satisfying. Now time to get into the Unity technical stuff. Everything in Unity is a game object. The player is a game object. The tiles are game objects. The barrels are, and the characters. So let's get into what a game object does. Every single game object has transform. Transforms are basically your position, rotation, and scale. Position, in this case, since it's a 2D game, we can only work in two axes, the X and the Y axis. Z is limited to 3D, so we can use the Z axis, but that's only 3D. Rotation, since this is a 2D game, we can only rotate in one axis, which is the Z axis. And lastly, scale. Scale is basically the size. Again, 2D, only two axes. And then there's this thing called components, where you can add them on objects. The player object has 3 components, one of which is written by me, and 2 of which are provided by Unity. Let's talk about rigid body 2D. Rigid body 2D is basically the physics component of the objects, which allows you to add force, change the object's mass, change the gravity scale, the linear drag, angular drag, all these physics terms. You can do that through code, like adding force or changing it middle of the game. I'll get into how it's used. And second of all is the box collider, which is the collision. As you can see here, the square or rectangle here. You can change the size, the offset, and the edge radius to make smoothen it out. Any questions so far? Are there collision? Yes, of course there is collision. I just explained it. The box collider. How to hack game? You can't hack the game. The box collider is the collision detector. And is there any inspiration behind this? No, not really. Just came up with a platformer and decided to make it something interesting and unique. Is a hot dog a sandwich? Is a hot dog a sandwich? I don't know. Any more questions so I can move on? You don't have to force yourself to ask a question, you know. No, I can't add Tom Heb Clifford to the game. Okay, moving on. So about the third component, the player controller, which is written by me. It's written in a script using the language C#. Let's take a look at it. Here, this is the player controller script. I know it's code. It's hard to look at, painful to look at, but bear with me. For these stuff are just variables, boring stuff. We can ignore them. Let's get to the interesting stuff, how the jump works. Here's the jump function. Jump function is function. Since I assume most of you here watching don't know much programming, I'll skip through the details and tell you the fun part, okay? Function is basically doing something. And in this case, what it's doing is that The physics component sets your y velocity to 0 and then adds force to it. So you can go upwards. Let's take a look at it in game. See, it's adding force upwards. It's just that simple. Let's go back to the code. And let's take a look at this. This is the satisfactory, or the jump, like, what was it? Long jump and short jump. Yes. So here, so the jump is called here if the player is on ground or has the Quixote time. Jump is called. But when the player is mid-air, if the player's velocity is greater than 0, then we can set the gravity scale to lower, meaning that the player will jump even higher and float a bit more. If we don't, it's going to be normal jump. And when the player's falling, we increase it more. Why? Because players like to have control when they're jumping, but when they're falling down, they want to fall down as soon as possible, so it doesn't feel too floaty. Any questions? What programming language is C#? It's using C#. Unity only uses C#. It used to use JavaScript, but not anymore. Any questions about this part? So far, the jump. Are there any boss battles in the game? No, sorry. Does the gravity affect the velocity? Yes, gravity, when you apply a force to the object going upwards, it's going to continue going upwards unless there's gravity acting on it. So the gravity, in this case here, slows down the player and brings them back down. How long did the animation take you versus the actual coding? Around the same time. Are most functions used predefined, or did you define? I defined them. Functions used, for example, adding force is already part of Unity 2D's library. All I had to do was add the physics component, rigid body 2D, and then use it to add force. How did you time the long jump duration? I did not time it actually. It just works on its own because it's based on player input. How it works? Take a look. If the player is in air and is holding down the button, gravity affects them less. If the player isn't doing that, the gravity affects them a little more. And if they're falling down, they can't do the long jump thing while falling down. So it's going to be even stronger. Did you incorporate physics into coding? I did not. It's part of Unity's rigid body 2D or Unity 2D physics. What was the hardest part of making the game? Not much. Mostly getting the physics numbers right. So we have to get the linear drag, get the forces right, so the game feels smooth and still realistically physical. I mean, I'm not going for realism, but since I'm using physics, it's gotta be using correct physics. Rigid RB2D is the rigid body 2D. Wait, let me show you. Rigid body 2D. This component on the game object. Basically what it is that it's a physics component. It's a predefined part of RB2D, right? Yes, RB2D is predefined already in Unity, already given to us by Unity. So it basically does physics for you. You don't need to write the math, which is really very convenient. You can just add forces and mess around with values, and it does everything for you. Yep. So next up, we'll take a look at the player walk. You'll be surprised to how easy the walk is, it's just this. This is the walk, a single line. We're adding horizontal force on the player based on the input. This is just input, like left or right, which is the bind to the arrow keys left and right. It's multiplied by a few variables, but don't worry about them. Those are just set the speed correctly. What happens when you lose all health? The level restarts. If you want, I can show it to you now. You can die by falling down, or by taking damage until you die. There you go. That's how it works. Is making a 3D version harder? In Unity, I think is much better in 3D. Unity is not that good with 2D. It just depends on the type of game you're making, because it's the same physics, except this time it's 2D. Is there a time for the direction change, left or right? I'll explain that. Is the direction change? There is a time. The moment you press the, let's say you're going right, the moment you press left, it sets a timer and increases your acceleration towards that direction. So instead of like making it instantaneous, it's smoother. So if you just tap it, you don't go too far to the left, and if you hold it down, you go as far as you want. You have to make custom animation using an external program like Photoshop. Yes, I did. I used A-Sprite, so it's more realistic. Yeah, it makes the control easier. It's all about making the player feel like they're in control. And since we're in the topic of movement, let me show you the code for the direction change. Okay. Here is the code for the direction change, this part. Take a look at it. First thing it does is check if the player is not on the ground, then checks if the player is at the peak of their jump. So if their velocity is more than -1 and less than 1, y velocity. And then it checks for the input. Is the player input the opposite side, opposite direction to the velocity? Check here. It takes the velocity.x, the horizontal velocity, and multiplies it by the input. If they're the same sign, meaning the same direction, it's going to be positive. If they're opposite directions, that means negative times positive, it's going to be negative. So that's how we check if it's negative or not. And then I reduce the x velocity, slow the player down a bit, and then give it a little timer here. During this time, during the small time for half a second, the player is 5 times faster. See the difference here? This is multiplied by 5, so the player is 5 times faster for the half a second to change directions in. Any questions about this? How long did it take you to reach the stage? Which stage? Specifically coding expert timers. Any questions? How long did it take you to this demo from scratch? 3 weeks. It's not completely from scratch. Unity has a lot of like built-in tools for you to make it. For example, the tile map and their physics engine due to 2D physics. The collision is already there, and most of it is just writing your own scripts and using them to your liking. Unity is very convenient. For example, if I'll show you a bit about the tile map system. Here's the grid and the tile palette. You can add tiles as you like and incorporate it into your game. It's simple, just drawing, and voila, you have a tile. Easily. Have you thought about using Java? Like coding from scratch without an engine? It's a bit harder. It is much harder. It's basically reinventing the wheel. If you honestly have no reason to not use an engine, it's not worth not using it. Unity is, I wouldn't say superior. It's much faster and easier to get going with the game. If you're coding it on your own, you're gonna have to write the engine yourself. So you're gonna waste time writing the engine, and then you're gonna waste more time making the game. It's more time efficient and easier. How does the game know, for example, that the characters need to throw his arms when he's falling down? That's the animation. I'll show you the animation. All right. Every single frame, this function is called, which sets the animator. We have a value for the y velocity, a boolean, which is a true or false statement if the player is running, and a true or false statement if the player is on the ground. So I'll show you a bit of the animator. We look at the player graphics game object. Player graphics has two components. One is the sprite renderer. Sprite renderer allows you to change the image of the player. I can change the image to whatever I like. See, the player is changing to different types of icons and characters. But if we want to animate this, how do we do it? We have a component called the animator, which is this, and a tab called the animation. What it does is it automatically changes the sprite for you. So let's take a look at the run animation. It does it by itself. Changes the sprites. Okay, then this is cool and all, but how do we change the animations midway? The way you do it is using the animator, which is this complicated tree, and it's controlled through code. So if the player is idle and the player is running, it does the run animation. If the player is falling, it does the fall animation. If the player jumps while running, goes through here and to the jump. That's how the animation works. Do companies use game engines or they code from scratch? Depends on the company. AAA companies make their own engine. Indie companies usually use game engines, pre-built. How to skip? Sorry, you can't really skip this live. It's kind of like a function. Changing the animation. It's more like it's updated real time, so it constantly checks for your values. See here, if I click, if it runs, then it's immediately going to change from idle to run. If I increase the velocity or decrease it, let's say I decrease it as in falling down, it's immediately going to go to fall. It's not a function, it's like constantly updated. Is that a flowchart? Maybe, I don't know. Can you make Mario like this? It's basically Mario, but since Nintendo doesn't like people stealing their IP, can't be Mario. So let's take a look at the jump mechanic. the weapon jump. So let me open that file up. Let's take a look at the weapon script. This is a class, a C# class. It's called weapon, and it derives from scriptable object. What that means is that it is its own thing, but borrows some stuff from its parent object, which is the scriptable object. The scriptable object allows us to do unique stuff, such as, let me show you, Unity, create new weapons. So I go weapons here, right click, create weapons. I can create a new bow, a new sword, a new wand. That's what it does. It allows us to store data to use it later in game. So I can use it anything like new test sword. I can change the attack time 12, damage to 5, and give it an icon. All that. So that's just about scriptable objects. So what about the weapon? So it takes a single scanner, scan movement. Scanner, single scanner to scan the movement of the character. It doesn't scan the movement of character, it just takes the values and updates it accordingly. Only weapons, yep, only weapons, no other items and stuff. If you could use for, oh yeah, if we could use Unity instead of JS, but JS was easier to set up a multiplayer game. Because yeah, socket IO and stuff, but in Unity you'll have to use the Unity network system, which is more complicated. Do you encounter obstacles in Unity, like crashing, not getting saved? What's the major obstacle you've encountered? Actually, the major obstacle is the physics itself. The physics itself is like very weird. You know, you have to fine-tune numbers, get the perfect thing, and also collision. Sometimes what would happen was that the ground would be uneven, so the player will be basically changing their Y velocity constantly while they're moving, which was a bit awkward. You encounter, okay, answer that. Any other questions? So I can go on explaining what the weapon is. No, I guess, okay. So weapons have a function called use weapon. It's an abstract, meaning that it's not defined yet. We don't know what it does. So what that allows us to do is create a new type of weapon, sword, and it overrides it, meaning that it gives it a new definition for the weapon. It has a few stuff in here, so let's just ignore these and look at this line. Let's zoom in so it's clear. So this takes in all the objects that's scanned in an area. So in a circle where the player attacks, let me show you in game. When the player attacks with a weapon, let me go grab the weapon real quick. It scans in an area around that dot, the attack position, and gives me all the objects that were hit. Let's say I click X, it gave me the information that there was a barrel right there, and accordingly I can do whatever I want with it. So in this case, I destroyed it. What's the difference between using a game, making a game using Unity and using Windows Forms? I don't think you can make games in Windows Forms. Why did you assume the red square is bad and killed it? Because the red square can damage you and it's a bad guy. I said so. Okay, so basically all this does is tells you what you hit in that circle. And then according to the information, we do something here. For every single object that we hit, we check, is it an enemy or it's indestructible? If it's an enemy, we damage it. If it's a destructible, like a barrel, we destroy it. Simple. Not too complicated. And here's the interesting jump function. Not function, or like mechanic. If the player is mid-air, and if the player is aiming down, and if the player has hit anything, the player is launched upwards. So basically like a mini jump. Is there any confusion here? Red is generally considered an enemy. Yes. Any questions about the weapon? Anything too confusing? This is when you jump on an enemy. Yes, when you hit an enemy with your sword underneath you, or an obstacle, or destructible, it launches you upwards. That's the little line of code that controls that. Any questions? Anything is too confusing? How does the bow work compared to the sword? Good question. So I guess we'll move on to the bow now. Okay. So this is the bow's script. Much shorter, because all it does is that it creates a game object, a new arrow, instantiate arrow at the attack position. And then we get the rigid body component of it ourselves, and then we add force to it based on the angle we're aiming at. Yes, bow is superior to the sword. So I'll demonstrate the bow quickly. I'll cheat a bit and give the player a sword. Or not a sword, the database bow. Look, whenever I press the button, it creates the object and adds force to it. And it's based on the direction I'm aiming. So I can aim upwards, to the side, or aim downwards. And it's instantiated on that dot, or created, basically. And then the arrow itself has a script. So let's take a look at the arrow itself. Player projectile. If you're Jedi Master, can you block the arrow with your sword? No, the sword cannot break the arrow, because they're both player projectiles, or they're both player attacks. Here, this is the player projectile. Here we have different variables for it. For the arrow, we can change its center of mass, damage it does, etc. But here is the same, basically, essentially the same thing as the sword. It scans for all the enemy. It doesn't scan for all the enemies. Since it's an object, we check for collision. So if it ever hits another object, it'll do something. So in this case, we're checking if it hits an enemy, a destructible, or the ground. Let's start with the ground, easy. If it hits the ground, it gets destroyed, simple. If it hits an enemy, same thing with the sword. It damages them and knocks them back. If it hits a destructible, it destroys it. Same thing with the sword. So you can see all the things are pretty similar. They all work in a similar fashion, and they're very simple. So basically, the sword is basically a bow that you can create an object, and then we get to the wand. Wand is basically, I don't think I'll need to explain it, but let's take a look at the code. It's the same thing as the bow. It creates an object, and it stays there and adds force and stays there, and is automatically destroyed after 5 seconds. Well, okay, so what does it do? Let me demonstrate what it does real quick. Basically, just like as you can jump on enemies, you can use the wand as a boost. It's a little interesting mechanic I came up with. Sword. I thought that it would be interesting to let the player control where they go themselves. Oop, no, I used that. Nope, there you go. Yeah, that's it. Any questions? Is the physics for the game defined in the Unity engine? Yes, it's already defined in the engine. The bow is the same as the sword but higher range. The difference is numbers. The bow does less damage and takes more time to fire again. I'm guessing you would open another file in the same project. Yeah, I'm opening different files in the same project. They're all scripts in Unity. I have a bunch of scripts here. Here's for weapons, player scripts, and this is the enemies. So if you design another level, you'll need to open a new file in the same project or something similar. How levels work, they're scenes. So it's like, here's a scene, here's the second scene, don't save. The second level is a scene. And the third level is also a scene. What you're doing at the end of each level is you basically start entering the new scene. You're not changing the level, you're entering a new scene. Okay, does the distance from the enemy affect the damage on the bow? No, not really. Not really, as in that the bow itself is affected by gravity, so at certain distance the bow is going to fall down. What are those white lines? The level bounds. So if you fall past that line, you die. What do you dislike about the Unity engine? Sometimes it's hard to use. Sometimes a bit like it has like it's kind of stupid on its own. For example, the 2D rendering stuff. I don't know how to explain it, but sometimes it's just the rendering is a bit weird. Also, another weird thing about Unity is that it's constantly updated, so you have to keep up. And sometimes there's a issue with the version of the game and the version of the actual engine you're using. How long did it take you to learn this? Just a few years. Making the whole game in JS. I don't even think about making the whole game in JS. No, I've not used Unreal, Ubisoft, or Nintendo. Nintendo, yeah. So I think I've explained most of the basic mechanics. Any last questions about the game? Anything you're interested in? Because the GitHub link, I will send you guys the GitHub link right now. This is the GitHub link I sent in chat, and this is the download. So you guys can download and play it yourself, or check out the codes and open it in your own Unity. Any last questions before I end the stream? What file do you run it as? It's not a file, it's a project, it's a file, and you can open it in Unity. How do we contribute to the game? By opening the game and trying it out first, and adding like features or mechanics that you'd like, or maybe making new levels. I'll make a documentation or a blog about how to add features to the game. What file do you run? It's not. I answered that. Do you need Unity to play it? No. To play it, you just download the release. To actually edit the code and take a look at the scenes, or edit the scene, you need Unity. You said sometimes the game version and Unity version are different. How do you solve that issue? There's no issue like that. Like, you can run the game, you can run the Unity file, but there will be some issues. For example, some things don't render properly. Some of the like built-in libraries or tools that you're using are outdated, or your version that you're using is outdated, and the actual game is a much more newer version. So you have to make sure that you're using the right version with the right project. You said the games. Okay, how does the AI work? Oh, the AI just doesn't do anything. It just walks back and forth until it reaches a certain place. I'll show you. Here is an enemy. Where is the enemy? Where is the enemy? Here. As you can see, if the player reaches the red, it starts going right. If the enemy reaches the red, goes right. If the enemy reaches the blue, goes left. Simple. Doesn't have to be too complicated. Good job, Serkis. Thank you. You can just keep using the same version of Unity. Yeah, you don't need to update unless there's a new feature that you like. For example, here I started with an earlier version, and then I realized there's a fix for a problem I was having on a newer version, so I just updated it. You don't have to update, but sometimes it's necessary for features that you want. Oh, thank you for sending the link. Yes, I agree with you, Anand. Marnie, best girl. So no more questions. Would you like something TensorFlow for advanced UI movements? It's just going left and right. I don't know what TensorFlow is, but just going left and right. It doesn't need to be too complicated. Simple AI is usually the best. Like it makes the enemies predictable, but still fun. Please, questions related to the project or the demo. I could run a workshop on Valorant if you want. So I guess this concludes the workshop. I hope you guys enjoyed and learned something new. I guess see you guys later. I'm gonna wait for like 5 minutes for questions, or 2 minutes, I guess. I guess everyone's saying bye. I guess no more questions. All right. Thank you for attending the workshop, and have a nice